Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of the Asclepius podcast, where we talk all things medicine and science with your host, Timothy Jew. In this podcast, we have guest speaker, Professor Love. Yes, I know, that's such a cool name. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about birth control and blood clots, the importance of communication in healthcare and academia, and so much more. Please don't forget to like, comment, rate, subscribe, share, and all that good stuff. It really helps the algorithm and will get the information out quicker. Regardless, hope you all enjoy.
Oh, hi there. So before we start today's episode, let's go over our sponsor, us. Now, if you are dying to part with your hard-earned cash, then feel free to support us on patreon.com/the Asclepius podcast. That's TheAsclepius podcast. Perks include being able to ask questions to future guests, suggesting future guests, getting cool original merchandise, and so much more. Hopefully, this is the first season, so we don't know how it's all going to play out, but either way. And once again, visit our patreon.com/the Asclepius podcast, or visit us at asclepiuspodcast.wixsite.com/home. Eventually, we'll try to get our own domain too. Anyway, look forward to seeing you soon. Are you extremely gifted? Do you have complete mastery over the arts? Well, my friends, if you are literally Leonardo da Vinci, DiCaprio, reincarnated, I would highly encourage you to participate in the seasonal Asclepius Podcast Art Challenge, where we have but the most able of artistic maestros submit their rendition of the Rod of Asclepius. Those that happen to edge out their competition will have their art not only used as our logo for the season, but will also have their art used as merchandise, with all the proceeds of that merchandise donated to Children's Hospital. How altruistic of you. If you are interested in showcasing your amazing talents or just helping out Children's Hospital or the podcast, then feel free to submit your art at our website at asclepiuspodcast.wixsite.com/home. Anyway, let's get back to the episode.
So let's just talk about Professor Love and set up some context before we get this show on the road. Let's first start off by giving credit to the amazing Amy, who was able to get Professor Love on for this episode since Amy's actually her student. In fact, we're going to have some questions from Amy herself on this podcast, so just be prepared for that. Anyway, let's talk about Professor Love. Although I don't know her outside of the podcast, Professor Love just seemed to be such a bright and warm ray of positivity.
I'm so proud of y'all for even doing this, and please, follow your impulses to do these things, because even if it doesn't make sense to you why you put all this time and energy into this right now, you might be helping one person who's going to go help 1,000. You're doing good work, so
thank you so much.
If you need anything else from me, you let me know.
Although I don't like pursuing things just because it's well received or because other people support it and yada yada yada, it's still really nice to have some words of encouragement to just help push you through the tough times. I guess what I'm really trying to say is that all of y'all should just put some positive ratings for this podcast, because it's practically a moral obligation. I mean, prima facie, assuming that the media you are digesting does not regress us to an immoral and horrible. But for real, it seems like a good reminder for the importance of small things. Professor Love's little words of encouragement really went a long way. Anyway, with that Timmy tangent out of the way, sorry to keep you waiting, Professor Love. Could you tell us a bit about yourself?
I got my master's degree at Clemson University. You don't have to call me doctor. I just have a master's in professional communication. And my research area was in the communication around birth control pills, how young women are given the risk communication, and what they know about the symptoms of a blood clot and the clotting disorder called Leiden factor 5, which is fairly common. My interest in that research stemmed from my own personal experience of having a massive stroke at age 28 after being on birth control pills, and my frustration with the lack of explanation as to why this happened to me and why I wasn't made aware of the risks of this medication when I was put on it in college.
What a crazy story. But don't worry, I'll ask questions about all of that later.
So, your research stems with birth control, the lack of communication surrounding it, and its potential harmful side effects, which is blood clots. Could you explain why birth control tends to lead or result in these blood clots?
Because it's synthetic hormones, and most birth control is progesterone and estrogen. Sometimes it's just progesterone. They say that's safer, but both of them can cause blood clots. And estrogen ups your clotting factor anyway. This is why they have to be real careful with women who are pregnant, is kind of being aware of that. It ups your ability to clot. And then when you have the synthetic hormone that's in your system too, that it dramatically increases your risk of blood clots, as well as affecting every system of the body. My further research went on to examine all the systems of the body that are affected by that medication, and it turns out that it's all of them. So it's not just blood clots that are a symptom or a side effect. It's everything from mental health to hair loss to vision to thyroid to kidney, like every system of the body. Because when we're talking about hormones, we're talking about regulating, right? So how can it only regulate certain things,
All right, it's time to get into some literature about the controlling of birth, or at least we'll figure out how these things work. So I read a research article called Combined Estrogen Progestin Oral Contraceptives, Patient Selection, Counseling, and Use by Allen et al. I kid you not, well, I guess birth control meds also kid you not. Okay, I'm done with the children puns. But anyway, the acronym for Combined Estrogen Progestin Oral Contraceptives is literally COX. Life sure has its moments. So, this article first talks about the primary mechanism of action for COX, which is to inhibit the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, as well as inhibiting luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. Now, let's review the endocrine and reproductive system, shall we? First, gonadotropin-releasing hormone gets released from the hypothalamus through the bloodstream to the anterior pituitary gland. The actual pathway is from the median eminence, which is posterior and atop the pituitary stalk, actually one of the few areas of the brain void of a blood-brain barrier, where it eventually finds its way through some fenestrated capillaries of the portal circulation that vascularizes the anterior pituitary gland. But once at the pituitary gland, we are going to be releasing our luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. Now, the follicle-stimulating hormone does just that. It stimulates the ovarian follicles, and the luteinizing hormone is going to be in charge of really coordinating the menstrual cycle, which happens to be sort of a little important thing for the birth of children, humans, babies. So, let's go over the cycle in a very simplified and abstracted version. The mnemonic device that I've come up with for this podcast episode is early parents fall making babies.
He tripped and fell and landed in his co-worker's vagina, and he's still stuck there.
I'm a little proud of this one, not gonna lie. So to start, our concentration of estrogen and progestin, or early parents, are going to fall from the previous cycle, which is going to incite the hypothalamus to release our gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which of course releases our follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. This is where we start the follicular stage, or the first letter of our fall. Now, releasing follicle-stimulating hormone will develop the follicles, which in turn produce estrogen. Estrogen is then going to start the development of the decidua, which is a mucous membrane that lines the uterus. Now, estrogen doesn't like to play with the others, so it actually decreases the concentration of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone until the end of the follicular stage, where the super high concentration of estrogen actually starts to increase the concentration of luteinizing hormone. This increase in luteinizing hormone leads us to ovulation, or our O of fall, where due to a surge of that luteinizing hormone, we have ovulation of an egg from a ruptured follicle. Then we have the luteinizing phase, or the L of our fall, where the LH, or the luteinizing hormone, actually develops and sustains that ruptured follicle into what we're going to call the corpus luteum. This corpus luteum actually secretes estrogen and progestin, decreasing follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone to prevent development of more eggs. And this is where we either end with menstruation or babies, the make babies part of our mnemonic. Now, menstruation occurs when that decreased luteinizing hormone no longer upkeeps our corpus luteum, which is then going to cause our early parents to fall and restart the whole process again. Or we make babies, where a blastocyte implants itself onto the uterine lining and starts secreting a luteinizing hormone analog called human chorionic gonadotropin, which will maintain the corpus luteum and maintain high levels of estrogen and progestin to go on and further develop until we go through fetal development. Whew. Now, the reason why I like this mnemonic device so much is that the early or estrogen is going to start the development of the decidua, but the parent or progesterone is going to maintain and support the decidua, almost raising it. Anyways, I digress. Now that we had our little review of the menstrual cycle, we see that tampering with any of these hormones would most likely create a lot of complications with the cycle, leading to no babies. Very cool.
So I've recently taken the MCATs, which was a very fun experience. But
Congratulations.
Thank you. But one of the areas of study that the MCAT requires is about the reproductive system. Me being the ignorant student that I was like, oh, this is going to be so fun. And I got to the female reproductive system and it traumatized me.
Now, I loved medicine my whole life, and I loved learning about the human body a bunch. But I never really enjoyed learning about any of the reproductive stuff, and admittedly, most of that is probably just because I was an immature kid and body parts just made me feel all uncomfortable. So, when it finally came time to actually uncover all the craziness that is the female reproductive system when studying for the MCATs, I was very unprepared, to say the least. I can only imagine how my face contorted and writhed as I read what seemed to be nature's attempt at a Hitchcock film. I mean, I legit remember a sentence where they said that the endometrium sloughs off. Like, what is sloughing? Yikes. Anyway, as I read more about the hormonal imbalances, mood swings, and abdominal cramps, I thought, well, at least it all ends at menopause. But oh no, my friends, because those two hormones that coordinate the menstrual cycle, the luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, well, yeah, those are still being released by the anterior pituitary gland once menopause is reached, but instead of actually fulfilling a purpose, they now just circulate in the blood, causing bloating, irritability, heat flashes, and more discomfort. And after reading all of this crazy stuff, I just couldn't help but say,
wow, everything just sucks. That's so interesting how you're
That's
able
one way to look at it. It could also be looked at as beautiful and amazing and empowering.
Of
but
course.
I could see how,
Right.
how, from your perspective, it might be like, whoa, that sucks.
and let's just acknowledge that I made a big and naive boo-boo. But thankfully, Professor Love handled my ignorance with such grace and patience, so I must thank her for that. Now, Professor Love, what is your stance on the lack of education regarding the female reproductive system?
Well, it's our birthright as people who have these reproductive organs to understand them, but it's just been so lost and so hushed in our culture that I don't think most women understand the cycles that they go through, and instead we put them on synthetic hormones that regulate their cycles, and they think that it's helping because it gives them a period, and I use that in quotation marks, and not as not as punctuation, a period. They give them a menstrual cycle, but it's not a menstrual cycle. It's fabricated by the synthetic hormones. So it gives you the appearance of having a healthy, normal cycle, and you never really get to understand your body the way that it's supposed to operate outside of being manipulated. And so I think that lack of knowledge and our lack of honoring the female reproductive system and the female menstruation, kind of arc of being a woman, like we've taken away all the things that are kind of sacred and beautiful about that process and really just kind of disconnected a lot of young women from their bodies. And I think that we're seeing the effects of that now. The birth control's been around for it's 2021, so 65 years about, and we still don't understand it. Like, does that make sense to you? What else have we studied for 65 years that we don't have a really good handle on what's going on with it?
And just another piece of evidence for the importance of diversity and representation. A large pool of perspectives and voices to hear might be a great way to better help everyone. Nice.
As an educator, when you talk about these topics, have you ever had students come up to you and be like, oh my goodness, thank you for this information? Have you seen like a positive effect from this teaching?
It's relatively new that I even talk about my personal experience in class. It's not something that I used to do because I've taught at Clemson and I've taught at College of Charleston too. But when it comes to teaching about how to find truth and research and all this stuff, I feel like it's only part of the picture if I teach that to my students without helping them understand where I come from and why I may look at it a little bit differently from some of their other teachers and the librarians and some of the other research methods they've experienced as students throughout their career as students. So I have had several students talk to me about birth control, but I'm not a medical professional, and anything I say should not be taken as substitute for medical advice. But I do have an interesting viewpoint, and I do feel like we need to have these conversations. I was telling Amy, like, I did a big research project with this. I got very involved with the work to try to educate women about the risks of birth control, and our funding got pulled, and for some personal reasons, I kind of stopped that side of my research, mostly because there wasn't an easy answer. But I think we're seeing in the world around us today what happens when we shy away from things that don't have an easy answer in all of our in every aspect of our world right now, is that we can't shy away from things that don't have an easy answer. And I hate that I can't just tell young women, well, just use this kind of birth control instead. This will make it safe, because we're not there yet. We're not there with a simple solution. But I think this disconnecting from our body and altering it with synthetic hormones without even understanding fully how our bodies work, what the consequences of taking this medication is, and what the side effects are, so that you know what to look for. If you don't even know how your body operates normally, and then you're a teenager and you're put on this medication, which they put you on for headaches, and which is ridiculous because headaches are contraindicated for that, but acne, regulating a cycle, like they've approved it for so many uses that they're putting young women on it younger and younger and younger. And when you're 13, you're going through puberty. You're not even aware of your cycles. You're not even aware of how your body operates. And then you're automatically being manipulated before you can even learn that information. And then there's the side effect too of it masking anything greater that's going on too. So there's a lot at play there, and it's a complicated topic with no easy answer. And I think that's why I've been hesitant to speak to my students about it before recently.
So before we move on to Amy's question, let's just reflect on what Professor Love said. First, we have this concept of birth control being contraindicated for headaches. Well, upon looking at some research called Combined Hormonal Contraceptives and Migraine, an update on the evidence by Calhoun et al., we see that COX are actually contraindicated or worsen the conditions for migraines with aura, the classic migraine. The reason? Well, that's because of the increased concentration of estrogen. So let's go over estrogen a bit. So estrogen affects the gene that is later transcribed and translated into proteins, and these particular proteins are going to be known as clotting factors, such as fibrinogen and yada yada. Now you might be asking yourself, why would we want estrogen to increase clotting? Well, during birth, increased clotting can prevent increased blood loss during pregnancy, which seems like a great idea because the birth of babies can be quite a large investment of blood from the mother. So, tying back to the original statement of birth control being contraindicated for headaches, the problem essentially is that people that are symptomatic for migraines with aura are at higher risk for strokes, and adding a hormone that increases blood clotting factors might not be a great idea. Just to clarify, strokes are when blood flow to your brain is cut off, normally due to a thrombus or blood clot. Now, if you're curious about the mechanism of migraines and how that would be related to strokes, like I am, well, you're sort of out of luck because the main mechanism is greatly debated as of now. Let's just say that the leading research points to a complex interplay of blood vessels and perivascular neurons that all coordinate to create a literal headache. If you want more insight, I would highly suggest a research article published in 2017 called An Update on the Blood Vessel in Migraine to get caught up with the science of migraines. This also briefly goes over a topic of research, healthcare, and the ambiguous ethics that coat every surface. And I would love to go over this, but for now, we'll just have to wait, my beautiful listeners.
Kind of like to jump in with that. I know there's kind of an issue pretty much in every field where, like, women aren't believed when they say something, especially, like, in medicine. Like, if you go to the hospital and you're like, this is happening to me, they're like, oh, it's not that bad, like, you know, just rest or something like that, and they're just not believed. Do you think, like, the fact that we're, like, it doesn't have an easy answer and we need to go more in depth, but we're, like, afraid, like, how does that contribute to people not getting the treatment they need because they're just not being believed?
Amy, that is such a good question, and there's so many factors I think that go into that. One is the hysterical women myth, right? So women have been painted as hysterical and emotional over, you know, centuries, that we can't be thought to, you know, we're moody and we don't know our own bodies, we don't know our own minds, we need to be protected and all of these things. And because of that, I think a lot of physicians and a lot of nurses too, and this is not just male physicians and nurses, this is all physicians and nurses, are kind of under this kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, almost false identifying of especially young women as not really knowing what's kind of going on with them and just being overly emotional. And the problem with that is that they didn't even start testing medication on both men and women until the 1980s. So they didn't understand how symptoms present of heart attacks in women so differently than they do in men. This was stuff that was, like, well under researched. And then you've got this idea that women just are just emotional, right? So you're just being hysterical. So when I went to the hospital and my left arm was numb and I was having trouble walking, they told me, and I had an unbelievably bad headache, and they told me that I just had a tension headache and I needed to learn how to manage my stress. And I thought, you know, I'm 28 years old. I've never had a headache like this. This doesn't feel like any headache should feel. It felt like my brain was literally being split open, because it was literally being split open. And so I got sent home from the emergency room twice. So we've got that idea that women don't know themselves, you know, and then we've got this idea of the research that's put out there. A lot of it is paid for by the pharmaceutical companies. So the doctors are being given this information that tells them that the chances of these things happening are minuscule, so don't even look for it. 95, I don't know, maybe you've heard of this, Tim, but like something like 99% of this, what's going on with people who have an illness going on, are the same 10% of things. Right? So doctors start to look for the same 10% of things. And then they're getting information that's saying this medication is much safer than it actually is. So they're not even being taught to look for those things. Right? The research that I did on the research project had so many young women that were killed, not just from the NuvaRing, which is particularly dangerous, but they were killed because their doctors didn't even know to look to see that they had a NuvaRing on. So they're not even being, whereas their lives might have been saved in the crisis, they weren't saved because the doctors just were told that this medication is so safe that it didn't even occur to them to say, she's having cascading blood clots. Maybe there's something hormonal going on, because again, they've been told this is very, very rare. And I just don't know that there's any way for us to know if it really is rare, if it really is that rare, because we don't talk about it. You know, the first people to find out that there was even a problem with clotting was actually happened in England because of their universal healthcare system. They shared research, they shared information, they shared stories in a way that we didn't do, and we still don't do. And we've prized so much of quantitative data that we've lost sight of qualitative data. And I have to tell you, when you're standing in a room with 15 sets of parents whose daughters have died from taking hormonal birth control, you know, which isn't absolutely necessary for anybody to take, you're not going to talk to them about statistics. You lose your kid, you don't care what the statistics are. You don't care that, you know, the pharmaceutical companies have done the research that says that this is really, really rare, because it's not really in their best interest to be upfront about what the risks are, is it? If they're paying for the research, there's a desired outcome.
How do we avoid this, bias? Like, if we're being taught to look for something, but we need to look for stuff that's not there, like, how do we make sure we're trying to avoid something like that happening?
I think just awareness, right? At this point, because there aren't easy answers in our world and we see so much change happening, being aware that you as young physicians need to trust your instincts a little bit more, not take everything that's in the medical journals and in the medical textbooks as the only way and the only proof, and to listen to your patients, right? And I think for young women, we need to start informing them. I don't have any desire of taking birth control away from young women. I know that an unexpected pregnancy is terrifying for a lot of people, for most people, and there are safer alternatives, obviously, but even with something like hormonal birth control, just if I had just known what the symptoms of a blood clot were, but that's not something you think about when you're in your 20s and you feel invincible, you know? So I think there's an education component. There's a self-advocacy component as someone who's taking medication. It's, you know, be a responsible patient and learn about, you know, what you're taking and what the side effects are. As a physician side, stop dismissing young women. Let's break this myth that we're hysterical and we don't understand our bodies, because it's killing women. I mean, especially the maternal death rate of Black women especially is ridiculous in this country. Like, and that's unacceptable. So I think there's a lot of components, Amy. Again, not one easy answer, but a lot of things that we can look at just by listening to each other. This is why I stress stories so much in class.
Now, to address the 90%, 10% thing that Professor Love was talking about, the colloquialism I've heard was that if you're in Texas and you hear hooves, think horses and not zebras. Unfortunately, I live in Colorado, though, so I have no idea what that means. Anyways, I mean, we're talking about a lot of things here, and obviously it's a very complicated issue. Healthcare, especially in America, is often more associated with driving capitalism than it is for pure altruism in medicine. And this is normally not the fault of physicians and healthcare workers, but oftentimes it's at the expense of our physicians and healthcare workers. One of the books I recently read, called Complications by Dr. Atul Gawande, actually goes into the concept of fixing the system as opposed to reprimanding the individuals. Not really advocating for physicians, but rather focusing on the flaws of healthcare in general. And I believe this relates to what Professor Love is touching on, because our physicians are, hopefully, trying to make the best decisions they can given what I coined their resolution of operation. Now, I've given this a lot of thought because I recently listened to a TED Talk stating that medicine does not save lives. Philosophy does. And after this interesting TED Talk, I was ultimately left questioning what the true purpose or role of the physician is. Although the answer might seem obvious, I implore our listeners to sit with this question for a bit. What is the actual true purpose of a physician? And what should be guiding their actions? Well, while I was philosophically parsing through all the information, I ultimately arrived at my own definition of healthcare while driving over to hang out with my girlfriend. Alright, are you ready for this inelegant definition? I believe that the role of a physician is to prima facie maximize the positive outcomes given the resolution of operation, meaning that in all standard cases, we want to statistically increase the amount of life as in longevity and quality while keeping in mind the totality of our impact. So, let's explore our resolutions of operations. On a microscopic level, or at the highest resolution, the physician hopes to provide the best care they can for their individual patient, listening to their needs and making proper assessments and plans. Now, at a bit more of a macroscopic level, or at a lower resolution, we have the total pool of patients you will eventually care for, which means that you might have to make some concessions at the microscopic level to provide better care for a larger population. This might mean reducing the time you have with one patient so the others in your clinic can receive more attention. Or this could also mean learning a new procedure, which requires you to introduce a little risk to your individual patients initially so that you can start providing for a larger sum of patients in the long run. Then, at the most macroscopic level, we have things like research, where physicians such as Dr. Adrian Kantrowitz creating one of the first implantable pacemakers in his garage. I don't know if that's really true, but if it is, that's dope. And Dr. Norman Shumway spending years of research on rejection and immunity, ultimately becoming what many consider the true father of heart transplant surgeries. We also have more recently emerging areas such as doctor influencers like Dr. Mike, or even Dr. Christian Bernard, the doctor to perform the first heart transplant, which obviously can introduce more intrigue and influx to medicine, which helps more people in the long run. Also, the reason why I'm quoting all these heart transplantation and cardiocentric examples so much is because I recently read Every Second Counts, A Race to the First Heart Transplant by Donald McRae. Fun book, by the way. And I didn't really feel like doing more research for this part. Sorry, your boy can be lazy at times. Anyways, all that to comment on the complicated daily risk assessment physicians and healthcare workers have to make to keep everything afloat. And perhaps the real problem doesn't lie with our healthcare workers, but with the big companies that move them like chess pieces. With that being said, however, despite the fact that we could view ourselves as just individual data in a big pool of statistics, with what little agency we do have, I feel like we should try to do our best, especially when the line of work you're a part of directly deals with life or death situations.
One thing I was interested in was you write articles. How did that happen, and have you learned anything very interesting from writing articles?
So about 5 years after I graduated and published my thesis, there were a group of women that found my research and offered me a job. They had just gotten the Nelson Pill hearings, which were the congressional testimony when they first started realizing women were having blood clots and things were going wrong with the birth control pill. They had a congressional hearing of a couple of weeks in 1969 and 1970 where they had doctors, all kinds of different doctors and experts testify. That had recently become available to these women through the Freedom of Information Act. And if I remember correctly, I think they said Bernie Sanders helped them with that. So they had this 1,500-page document that they wanted me to read and write articles about. So the articles that you're talking about came from the research that I did in the Nelson Pill hearings, in that congressional testimony, combined with the PubMed stuff and the other research that I did to say, okay, this is what they were talking about in 1969 and 1970. What do we know now? And that's when I noticed the pattern that all of the newest research from the 40 to 50 years later was still saying the same things. Oh, it's inconclusive. Oh, we need more research. But at the same time, they're telling doctors, this is the most well-researched medication. It's totally safe. Put women on it for everything. So we see there's two different things going on here. Like, how can we possibly need so much more research that we can't? They only recently admitted that there's a mental health component to birth control pills, whereas they had women in the original test group, they had a suicide, and there was some missing information even in my copy of the Nelson Pill hearings that I was able to get a hold of later, and it was about that particular, I believe there were 2 deaths. I'd have to go back and double check it, but so I remember when I switched my birth control medication shortly after I got married, I asked my doctor, I said, I've gained all this weight, I have this acne, and I'm really kind of sad. And she goes, oh, that's not your birth control pills. And now they're finally coming out and saying, and that was in the early 2000s. Now they're finally coming out, and you can find many articles now on the connection between mental health and how can a synthetic hormone that affects every system of the body not affect your mental health? So you've got thousands and thousands of women that are being told, oh, it's not your medication, you're just crazy. It's the same line as, nothing's wrong with you, you just have a tension headache. So it makes you feel crazy. And then it makes you wonder how many relationships have ended and how many, jobs have been lost and all of these things because we won't address the truth about it, because then we don't make the sales.
Wow. Did anyone just shift a little? I love these uncomfortable topics and just blatant slaps to faces. So let's go over the steps required to become an FDA-approved drug, shall we? First, we have to do preclinical trials on animals that prove the efficacy of the medication. Assuming that all statistically checks out, we then try an investigational new drug or IND application, which then transitions us into clinical trials in humans. Phase 1 trials are conducted in a small number of volunteers to assess serious toxicities. Phase 2 is where they attempt to find effective doses in patients, maybe like 5 milligrams, maybe like 12 kilos. The last step is to undergo phase 3 trials trials that attempt to assess safety and then compare the efficacy of the drug to placebos from a sample size of about a few hundred to a few thousand. This is where the sponsor then submits a new drug application or NDA, and then we can finally start the good stuff. Yep, I'm talking about marketing, baby. We have drug reps coming in to offer free food, free samples, and pretty looking brochures, all of which I shamefully must admit enjoying. I mean, the constant free Chick-fil-A catering. Ugh, so good. Anyway, we also start saturating screen time with extremely relatable looking actors in slow motion, keeling over, feigning pain and discomfort, and then awkwardly dancing while the end credits start talking about the side effects ranging from mild diarrhea to death and yada yada. Well, now we require the randomized control trial, or RCT, to gain approval of the medication. However, when studies are conducted that assess the medication for just long enough to assess efficacy endpoints, what we find is a slight manipulation of the statistics to garner favorable results. If you know anything about statistics, what we find is that with larger sample sizes or more data, we get a more accurate representation of our population that we are studying. There's also multivariable analysis and double-blind studies that we also have to keep in mind. The premature conclusion of the RCT can actually lead us to underestimate the frequency of common side effects and overestimate the efficacy of the drug. Also, let's just keep in mind that there are probably a lot of confounding variables, such as the fact that people who are willing to participate in health-centric studies are probably healthier or at least more diligent with monitoring their health, just to name a few. So you might be sensing some ethical infringement or potential for ethical infringement here. And if you do find this interesting, I would highly suggest Ethical Issues in New Drug Prescribing by Cole et al. For the interesting read.
So it's, and the advertising, the fact that you can even advertise for pharmaceuticals, there's so many components that go into how this misinformation, and that's why I think it's a series of several things that need to happen. Educated patients, educated physicians. Maybe sometimes you need to look for the zebra. I don't know. You know, like people are not all the same and they don't react to medication all the same. And maybe there needs to be some sort of compassion training or empathy training. It would be really sad, I think, if they made medical stuff online. I've seen ads for that. I've seen ads for birth control online without having to go see a doctor, and erectile dysfunction medication without having to go see a doctor. And I feel like, should we be putting people on this medication without them talking to someone? And I think a lot of physicians are seeing the value of a more holistic approach. You know, we in Western medicine, you know, we only want to quantify. But if we look at Eastern medicine, acupuncture and, you know, traditional Chinese medicine, they have always been looking at the system of the body as a whole for thousands and thousands of years. And yes, nobody paid to study it because who has the money to pay for the research? Not the makers of acupuncture needles, right? You know? So we couldn't quantify Eastern medicine, so we decided it didn't have value. And then we went completely with, you know, science without even really thinking about, well, who's paying for the science?
And Professor Love brings up an interesting topic of Eastern versus Western and this whole Western chauvinistic perspective. Personally, seeing my relatives heavily delve into drug sharing and all of those things that are common within Eastern communities that my Western colleagues and education implores me to reject, I found myself always trying to distance myself from Eastern medicine as much as possible, almost even embarrassed by it. But upon another iterative step of maturity, I've come to realize that there are some holistically important factors that I now appreciate about Eastern medicine, and perhaps a healthy commingle between the two can offer the greatest care. Even while exploring my most recent read, a book called Gödel Escher Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid, that talks about how unconscious constituents can coordinate in a complex whole to refer to itself and become conscious. I'll probably dedicate a whole podcast to this book, but anyway, the main point I wanted to talk about is how this book exposed me to a completely foreign and new branch of philosophy known as Zen. It's like almost a complete departure from Western philosophy, where it seems to lean into anti-logic, which refreshingly alleviates our desire to logically reduce our existence in life into manageable bits of information. And given the fact that I've been a big proponent of Stoicism for most of my nascent study of philosophy, it seems like just a reminder for the power of keeping an open mind.
As an educator, and I ask all of our educators, have you figured out ways to sort of encourage them to get through the material?
Absolutely. And first of all, may I say that the fact that y'all are even doing this is amazing. That already shows that you are open to change and that you have a place in modern medicine to change it. More than ever, my students are amazing and inspiring beings. And so what I try to cultivate in my classroom is honest communication about what we're all going through, more so now than ever. I mean, we are in a pandemic. This is unprecedented stuff. The pressure on students was already tremendous before we went into a pandemic. I mean, I did not have to choose my major when I was 14 to decide which classes I wanted to take in high school, to decide which college I was allowed to apply to by picking a major. It's unbelievable the pressure that's been put on y'all. And so for me as an educator, I want to take some of that pressure off. I want to say, I see you, I know you, I hear you. I'm not going to be one of those people that tells you this is the best time of your life, because honestly, there's not going to be any other time in your life when you're jumping from 6 different subjects at a time and expected to be proficient in all of them. That doesn't happen outside of the academic area. And even if you stayed in the academic area, that wouldn't happen. You would have one specialized area that you became an expert in. You wouldn't be expected to teach in every department in the college, but that's what we ask you all to do, is to hop from course to course to course. So it makes perfect sense to me that you would be overwhelmed. And not only that, but I feel like the purpose of college is for you to really get to know yourself and find out who you are and what you want to do. So if you've got these blinders on that are just achieve, get the grade, get to the next class, get that grade, get to the MCATs, get to the GRE, get to graduate school, get in a good graduate school, then it's like, okay. So in my class, I really try to bring in honest communication about what we're all going through, right? And joy. For my goal isn't that my students become perfect at the material. My goal is that they learn about themselves and they develop skills that help them bring out the best versions of themselves. And that's why I love doing what I do, because I have to tell you, even in the last 2 semesters, the awareness, the emotional intelligence, the compassion I have seen in your generation blows my mind, and it gives me so much hope for the future.
Very surprising, because I feel like an idiot, and my friends and I definitely do. We're just blabbering around.
Here's a secret, Tim. You're gonna be 20 years older, and you're still gonna feel like an idiot, and you're still gonna feel like you haven't figured out. Even once you get your white doctor's coat and you're treating patients, you're still gonna feel like you don't have it figured out. And
right.
The adults that are acting like they have it figured out, they're just pretending. Everybody's just pretending. So why don't we all just stop pretending? Just say, hey, there's no easy answers, but let's start having conversations. Let's start listening to each other as people.
I love it so much.
Right? I learn as much from my students as hopefully they learn from me.
To pursue a master's degree, that's a big undertaking. Did you ever find troubles with getting your master's degree? Did you ever find points where you were gritting your teeth and you were like, why did I choose this route?
Tim, that's a great question. I have kind of an unusual story, and it's actually the stroke that led me to the graduate degree. I didn't get my master's degree until after I had been out of my undergrad for 10 years. My original career field was radio and television, and I worked in radio in Central Florida. And then I got married, and my husband wanted to pursue a PhD at Clemson University. So we moved from Central Florida, which is a big media market, very big media market, to Clemson, South Carolina, which is a very tiny place comparatively. And it was there the first few months that we were there that I had the stroke. And I was so overwhelmed. I had to learn how to do math again. I had to learn how to walk again. And I thought, there's no way I can go get like an 8-to-5 job. I can't sit in a cubicle from 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. And so I went and I talked to the director of the program, the master's program that I did. And she was very, very helpful. And she said, listen, we would love to have you in the master's program, and we will work at your pace. So instead of having to take 3 classes, which is full-time for a master's degree, she only made me take 2. And then I could do research hours on the side. So it was a kind of an easing back into of normalcy. But it was also, graduate school is so very different from undergrad. It changed how I think. I felt like undergrad was just learning about stuff, but graduate school was about teaching me how to really think. And so as someone who had spent 10 years in the communications industry in radio, to go back into the classroom and have these professors that had never worked in industry talking about how important this information was with no context, I found that wildly frustrating because I think there are aspects of academia that self-perpetuate, right? We think we're important, so we're gonna, we're gonna research this niche stuff. And it wasn't until I came to the end of my graduate degree that I really learned how to think differently, that I saw the value in it. But for sure, the first year was a huge struggle. It was a struggle because I had just had a stroke. It was a struggle to be back in the classroom, listening to all these heady ideas about communication and these professors talking about things that I just didn't think were that important and didn't make sense in the real world. But ultimately, it did. It changed me, and it opened my viewpoint for sure. So there's definitely value in pursuing a graduate degree, but just like anything worth having, it's not going to come easily.
Going back to what you said you suffered through the stroke and you had to relearn math. And how did you get through that process of recovering? Because that seems like a very terrifying thought.
I think my ignorance worked in my favor. I didn't really understand what a stroke was. Who at 28 really understands what a stroke is? I'm like, that happens to old people. So it never occurred to me that there would be anything wrong with me or that I wouldn't recover fully. So the recovery process was kind of challenging. I would have one day where I could walk with assistance, and then the next day I wouldn't be able to get out of the wheelchair. And I was like, what is happening? I'm 28 years old. I can't walk. What do you mean? But it just never occurred to me that maybe it wouldn't come back. So I just decided it was all going to come back. And eventually it did. But the math thing was an interesting component because they'll test you. They put you in this rehabilitation kind of situation where you've got physical rehabilitation, mental rehabilitation, occupational. And they asked me about a math problem. It was a very simple problem about, a percentage. If this item is on sale at a store for this % off, how much does it cost? And I was a really good shopper back then. So for me, that would have taken no time at all, and I couldn't do it. And to know that I used to be able to do it was kind of wow. But I knew I wanted to go to grad school because I didn't want to try to get a job. So I was like, I've got to study for the GRE. And so I just sat at my kitchen. I couldn't drive because I had had seizures during the stroke. And so then they said, well, you can't drive for 6 months. We need you on seizure medication. And so here I am isolated in Clemson with no friends, no job, can't drive. So I studied for the GRE and I watched a lot of World Cup. It was World Cup soccer that year, and that's when I really fell in love with World Cup soccer. So that kept me going.
That's such an inspiring story. The prospect of aging or like time compounding. I've always had nightmares of like losing like functionality within my hands, which would obviously make sense if I want to pursue a career as a physician. But also like losing my ability to think.
I will say though, Tim, in the things that we think we lose, there's always gifts.
And there it is, the quote of the day.
Right? So like the worst thing ever that I could have imagined at 28 happened, and now I'm not afraid of that.
Right.
So there's gifts. There's gifts in it all.
I was actually wondering, you always say that like you're inspired by your students just as much as like you think that you inspired them. I was just wondering if there's like an instant that like it kind of just like changed your mind even.
A lot of times they'll say something that will astound me with their insight. What I have been constantly astounded by, especially over the past year and a half since we've gone on to Zoom classes and all of this, is the lessons and the maturity that y'all have that I just there was no way I had that at your age. I'm not even sure I had that, 5 years ago, that I see that y'all are coming to. And so as hard as this world has been for you, and as much as I wish I could take away from you all of the things that you're struggling with, I see, and the way I describe it to my colleagues is I see a bunch of little pieces of coal turning into diamonds, whereas people my age, we're just starting to be the diamonds. We're just getting out of this idea of who we should have been or what we should have done, and really starting to embrace our inner, and the struggles that we've gone through. Like I was just saying, in the struggles we have the gifts. And as much as I hate that you haven't been able to have this kind of carefree college existence, I think the gifts that you're getting are immeasurable, and I just see a whole generation of people that are going to make big, great changes in the world. Constantly amaze me.
It's such a heartwarming answer. Makes me feel good about myself. I'm like, oh, wow.
When people try to talk to me, they're like, oh, kids these days. And I was like, don't even come at me with that. Let me tell you about my students and how amazing they are. They are lighting up the world. Because this is the kind of stuff you need to do. Like, you're having a podcast about the thing that you're passionate about in the field you want to go into. We have the technology to allow for that, but you're seeking out these experiences and using your time to do that. I imagine you're probably not getting paid for this.
Nope.
Right?
Although if anyone wants to sponsor, just letting you all know.
Absolutely. Sponsor this podcast. But that's so beautiful and amazing. I mean, you could just be, I don't know, doing bong rips or something in a dorm room, but you're not. You're like, hey, you know what? I want to learn more. I want to grow more. And that's what we need. We need people who are open-minded and who listen to each other and have a desire. It's beautiful.
Thank you so much. That inspires me to make more podcast episodes.
And there you have it, folks. I've just demonstrated my ability to take a compliment gracefully. Anyway, to end off the podcast, Professor Love.
Do you have any words of advice or encouragement or anything like that you'd like to leave off on?
My advice would be, don't try to be anyone else. Be you, because your gifts are unique and they've been given to you. You are the only version of yourself that's ever going to exist, ever, across all time and space. So don't try to see the world like anyone else, and don't try to be anyone else. Just get to know you, fall in love with you. You're the one you've got to spend the rest of your life with. And without you taking the time to learn who you really are, we are robbed of the gifts that you have to share.
In conclusion, we learned about the importance of better communication in medicine and in science. We talked about the sensitive place of medicine in the world and how we are supposed to situate ourselves. And we got to hear some very encouraging words from Professor Love to the new generation of students that are eventually going to become the great leaders of tomorrow. Thank you all for tuning in. If you enjoyed the podcast, hit the like button, comment, subscribe, and rate. It really helps. If you didn't enjoy the podcast or you just feel like some constructive feedback is warranted, please also comment below. Anyways, this is the Asclepius podcast with your host, Whippathy Goo. The next episode will be about getting into medical school with Dr. Shirag Shamasian, CEO and founder of Shamasian Academic Consulting. Woo, we're done, boys. Let's go.